Hi, I'm Graham Blackburn, and this is Traditional Woodworking by Hand. And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the continued availability of Sash Ovolo planes. We've been talking in the past about various molding planes, special purpose planes, and all sorts of wooden planes. And and I'm very grateful for the fact that many of you have taken me up on my offer to send me comments and ask me questions. And I want to address a particular comment that a viewer made recently. The comment was that it's all very well for me to talk about these planes and say that they can still be found on eBay and flea markets and all sorts of other places. But this particular viewer complained that when he went to local flea markets, the dealers got there first and then put things up on eBay at exorbitant prices. And I'm here to say that that may be the case in some places, but there are still literally thousands of these planes available. Quite apart from the fact that now increasingly many modern contemporary tool makers are actually remaking these planes. And while I support that effort, those planes, of course, cost a lot more than what you can find if you go hunting at flea markets. Here's one that I found just last week, and I paid the princely price of $5 for it. So they're available. So, what is this? Well, this particular plane is what's known as a Sash Ovolo plane. Sash is the technical term for the frame that glass sits in a lot of windows. And we did an episode some time ago about how to make a window frame. And we used a plane that not only cut the molding that you see inside the window, but also that cut the little groove for where the glass and then the putty goes. Before those planes were invented, the common the more common plane was a plane that cut just the molding on the inside of the glass, and it's called a sash ovolo, which means that it has a fence, it has a depth stop, and it has what's known as an ovolo. Now, I've also mentioned in the past that ovolo refers to a little concave curve, which ends up making a little convex shape in the window frame. And I've also mentioned the fact that in really high-end work, if that curve was part of a circle, it would belong to what we commonly refer to as the Roman group of moldings. If, on the other hand, that little curve was a little more sophisticated and was part of an oval, hence the name ovolo, then it would belong to the Greek family. But in the case of planes designed to cut the molding on the inside of window frames, whether this is part of a circle or whether it's part of an ovolo, it's nevertheless pretty much always referred to as a sash ovolo plane. Now, aside from it being really useful if you're repairing or making new window frames, it's also, since it doesn't have the extra bit that cuts the groove for the glass to go in, it's also a wonderful plane to use as an edging plane for the tops of tabletops or the tops of counters or the tops of anything. If you have a square-edged piece of furniture, that's sometimes considered very contemporary, but it's nice to have some kind of pattern on the edge for various reasons. And this particular shape, the little ovolo, is a really nice way to edge a tabletop. Here's a piece that you can see what it looks like when it's finished. Now, this is typically done along the edge, just as parts of a window would be, but you can do it at the end too. I didn't really finish that, but you can see you can go all the way around. So I'm going to put this piece of wood in the vise, and I'm going to use this plane, the Sash Ovolo plane, to make this really nice edging that you can buy router bits to do, but which are nowhere near as exact and that change shape and that are, apart from being noisy and expensive, as I continually say, don't often leave as nice a surface. So let's look at this in more detail and see how it's used. First of all, you'll notice, as I've said before, that this plane is designed to be held at an angle when I use it rather than straight up. This would be how it would be used if it were held straight up. But in order to make the cut easier, and in order to provide both a depth stop and a depth guide, this plane is designed to be held at an angle, which we call spring. And the spring angle is invariably marked on the toe of the plane by at least one line. This line represents the vertical line, and at right angles to it, you can see that there's another line that represents what will be the horizontal. This should also be obvious by the fact that the fence is at an angle. If the plane were to be held upright, this fence would be vertical, but it's not. So you put the plane on the wood so that the fence is vertical and the spring line is vertical, but the plane is tilted over. And as a further guide, you can see that this part of the plane, where there's no iron, this functions as the depth stop. You could just make this molding with a round plane, but it is infinitely easier to use a plane with a width guide and a depth stop, because then when the plane stops working, when it's no longer cutting or shaving, you know that you've produced a perfect molding. So let's have a little go. Let's see how this works. But first of all, here's another tip. Very often, it makes much more sense to start a complicated molding at the far end of the wood. The reason is that if I start at this end, and if the grain is particularly wavy or whatever, it's conceivable, very possible, that the plane can wander away from the wood. Whereas if I start planing at the end of the wood, then and progressively work my way back, then there is always somewhere for the plane to follow what it cut before. One other tip before we plane this is that, as was typical in days of yore before we had routers, if you had to make a molding, it made a lot of sense to work on a stock that was perhaps just an inch or two longer than what you actually needed. Because as you can see here, if I put the plane on the very beginning of the wood, there's a lot of plane that's not supported. And similarly, when I get to the end of the wood, there's also a lot of the plane that's not supported. So a tip to bear in mind is, if you want to shape the edge of a table or a countertop or anything that you want to put a nice finish to, it helps if you can start with a slightly bigger piece of wood than what you actually need. So let's have a go. We put the plane on the wood so that the spring line is vertical and that the fence is vertical. And if you look really closely, you can see that what's going to be the depth stop is also horizontal. So I'm starting at this end and I'm taking a few cuts, and already you can see that I've created the first little shelf. And then I progressively work my way back, and as I do that, you begin to see the curve taking shape. At this point, you can now not only see the bottom flat edge, you can not only see the quarter round curve, and I should point out that although technically speaking, these were all originally quarter rounds, in the middle of the 18th century, when the Greek revival happened, they started to make these quarter rounds parts of an oval rather than parts of a circle. But so far as Sash Ovolo planes were concerned, they still were very, very largely all just quarters of a circle. So there you can see, I've not finished the whole molding, but you can see at the far end we have the nice flat piece, we have the quarter round, even though in this case it's actually more of a quarter oval, and then we have the top part. When this part of the plane, the depth stop, is riding on this, the rest of the blade will not cut, which means that the molding itself will be perfectly proportioned and perfectly cut. Now, this particular Sash Ovolo plane, this was made by one Thomas Heels, you can see his name there, in Nottingham, England, in 1830 to 1832. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I found this recently at a flea market for the princely price of $5. I just wanted you to know that these are still regularly available, and I think it's kind of astonishing that you can find something that's over 150 years old, or however long ago 1832 was, and that still works perfectly. And I think, even though it was originally designed for making windows, that this is a very nice way to end or to edge the end of a countertop or a tabletop. So once again, as I've done many times before, I want to encourage you to look for these planes and remember the tips that I've given you about using them. Look to see if there's a spring line, so you know which way round to hold the plane. Start at the far end instead of the near end, and make sure that you have the iron nicely set, which, by the way, typically only needs to be sharpened on the back side, not on the curved side, which is why a plane that was made in 1832 is still working perfectly today. So if you want to learn more about these planes, and we'll be talking about some other more complicated versions, don't forget, hit the subscribe button and the little like button that comes up afterwards. And as I've said before, I'm very happy to answer all your queries. So thanks for watching. Have a good day and happy planing.